They said we were walking into hell, but when the doors opened, we couldn't believe what we saw. Elsa Schmidt stared at the American shores with disbelief. For what seemed like an eternity, all she had known was the fear of the unknown, the endless stories of American brutality, and the images of a nation that, to her, had become a symbol of all that was wrong with the world. Yet, as the ship's hull scraped against the dock, something in her heart began to shift. The air was thick and warm, different from the cold, damp prisons she had left behind. There was a strange, almost intoxicating freshness in the air, an unexpected sensation that she couldn't quite place. The dock stretched before her, wide and vast, with no barbed wire in sight, no guards marching in their usual stern formation. Instead, there was a hum of life. Workers moved about, seemingly unhurried, while boats glided across the water, their presence marking a stark contrast to the desperation Elsa had anticipated. She could hear a faint sound of children's laughter somewhere in the distance, and for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a world where the war had never reached these shores. As she stepped off the gangway and onto American soil, she hesitated. The earth beneath her feet felt different, not the hardened, bomb-scarred soil of her homeland, but soft, warm, and alive. She had been told by propaganda to expect a brutal reception, perhaps even death. But as she looked around at the ordinary civilians, going about their daily business with no sign of hostility, Elsa could not reconcile this peaceful landscape with the stories she had heard. There were no angry mobs, no soldiers with rifles at the ready, only civilians going about their day as if the world had not been torn apart by war. She felt a strange sensation in her chest. Was it hope? Or was it just disbelief? Elsa didn't know. Her feet moved forward, but her mind was still trapped in a world of doubt. She wasn't alone. The other German POWs, mostly women like herself, shuffled behind her, their expressions mirroring her own confusion. They had expected cruelty, but what they saw instead was ordinary life, something so far removed from the horrors they had been promised that they couldn't make sense of it. Elsa could feel the weight of every step as they were ushered into a new reality. This was supposed to be America, the land of the enemy. But the sight of it made her question everything she thought she knew about the world. As they moved through the port, her eyes caught sight of an American soldier, a man, no older than her own brother, his uniform pressed and clean. He stood there, a smile on his face, as if he didn't see the enemy before him, but just another human being. The propaganda had told her these men were savages, but the kindness in his eyes struck Elsa like a thunderclap. Could they all be wrong? Was this truly the land of hope and freedom? Elsa couldn't believe it, and yet, she couldn't deny what her senses were telling her. The air, the sights, the sounds, they were all telling a different story than what her mind had been fed. This was a world she never imagined, one she couldn't understand, but it was real. And for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself a small, cautious breath of hope. Elsa stood silently as the warm breeze of Virginia filled her lungs. The unfamiliar scent of earth and greenery seemed to calm her, but the disbelief in her heart grew heavier with each passing second. She had expected to be treated like an enemy, to be viewed with contempt, but this was nothing like the stories she had heard. As she looked around at the sprawling port, the small, peaceful American town on the horizon, she began to question everything she thought she knew about the world. Was it really possible that she was standing on the soil of the enemy? The sounds of the bustling docks, the call of the workers, the hum of the trucks, felt surreal. She had always been told that America was a savage land, full of hostility and anger, but this place seemed alive with ordinary, everyday activities. It was the last thing she had expected. As she stepped forward, her feet heavier with each step, she saw the faces of her fellow prisoners, their expressions just as confused as hers. They were all in this together, but none of them knew what to expect. They had been told so many lies. They had been told that America was a land of hatred, a place where their suffering would only be deepened. But here, all they saw was life, a life they could hardly recognize. Elsa's heart raced as they were escorted further into the port. She couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, like an intruder in someone else's home. But with each step, something inside her began to stir. She couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the sight of the children playing by the docks, or the way the American soldiers moved about, focused on their duties but not with the cruel determination she had expected. No one had shouted at them. No one had raised their fists in anger. They had been greeted with silence, but that silence held no malice, no hatred. Elsa's mind began to work faster. Could it be that they had been wrong? Could it be that all the stories, all the propaganda, had been lies? The thought felt impossible, but the evidence around her was undeniable. As they were herded into a waiting area, Elsa's eyes met those of a young American soldier standing guard. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculate. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she felt a strange shift in the air between them. It was brief, but enough to make her wonder. She had heard that the Americans had no mercy, but here, standing before her, was someone who had done nothing but watch her and her fellow prisoners. The soldier gave her a nod, nothing more, but the warmth in his gesture took Elsa by surprise. She had expected to feel fear, to feel hatred radiating from him. But instead, she felt nothing, just a flicker of recognition, like two people caught in the same moment of uncertainty. Elsa turned away, her mind swirling with confusion. She wasn't ready to confront these feelings yet. She wasn't ready to admit that the world she had grown up in, the world of war and propaganda, might not be as simple as she had been taught. But something was stirring in her, something that made her look at this new reality with fresh eyes. They were led into a large tent where they were told to sit. There, for the first time, Elsa realized how tired she was, physically and emotionally. The weight of the journey, the months of captivity, the constant fear, it had all taken its toll. As they waited, a soldier came around offering cups of water. Elsa took one, her hand trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. The cold water felt refreshing, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the coolness fill her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a breath of relief. The soldier smiled at her, his expression kind, though it was clear he had no idea of the turmoil inside her. Elsa's thoughts were interrupted as another soldier entered, carrying something small wrapped in cloth. As he approached, he placed it in her hands. It was a piece of bread, simple, plain, but to Elsa, it was more than just food. It was a symbol, a moment of kindness that contradicted everything she had been told. She didn't know how to respond. She wanted to speak, to ask why, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was take the bread, break off a piece, and slowly chew. The taste was unfamiliar, but it was real. It was something that felt almost normal, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner. The bread was a simple act, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in Elsa's mind. Maybe there was something more to this land, something she hadn't expected. She sat quietly, her mind racing, as the world around her began to take on a new meaning. As the days passed, Elsa's thoughts became a whirlwind of confusion. She couldn't understand what was happening. Every moment felt like a blur. She was no longer in a foreign land where cruelty was a given, no longer in a place where survival meant constant fear. Here, she was treated like a human being, not an enemy. And yet, the questions in her mind only grew louder with each passing day. How could this be? How could the Americans be so different from what she had been told? She had heard the stories, the rumors, the horrifying tales of their brutal nature. But here, on American soil, she was starting to see another side. The kindness she was receiving made her question everything. The bread she had been given was still fresh in her mind, and now, she couldn't help but wonder if she had been wrong about everything. Was there a possibility that these men and women weren't the monsters she had been taught to fear? Elsa's world had always been defined by the sharp lines of war, black and white, enemy and ally, victory and defeat. But now, in this strange new land, those lines were beginning to blur. Her days had settled into a routine of work, waiting, and contemplation. She was assigned to a group of other German women, most of them younger than her, who had also been captured in North Africa. They were put to work in small jobs around the camp, cleaning, preparing food, and sorting supplies. The work wasn't hard, but it was unfamiliar, and the days stretched long. The camp, though far from a luxury, was nothing like the horrific places she had imagined. The barracks were simple but clean, with enough room to stretch out at night. The food, though basic, was enough to keep them going. Elsa had expected starvation. Instead, they were fed 3 meals a day, and no one had gone hungry. It was a far cry from what she had imagined, and it only made her feel more isolated, more uncertain. She found herself watching the American soldiers who moved through the camp, their faces set in expressions of indifference. But there was something else there too, something she couldn't quite place. They weren't the monstrous figures she had been warned about. They were just men, doing their jobs, treating her with the same detachment that soldiers everywhere did. But then, there was one soldier who stood out from the rest. His name was James Walker. Elsa had seen him a few times, but it was one encounter that left a lasting impression. It was a late afternoon when she found herself alone in the mess hall, cleaning the tables. She had just finished when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw James standing there, a slight smile on his face. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice soft, his tone genuinely concerned. Elsa didn't know how to respond. She had never been asked that question before, certainly not by a soldier. The men she had known in the war had always been too focused on the battle, too preoccupied with survival. They had never asked how she felt. She hesitated, unsure of what to say. Okay," she replied, her voice quiet. James nodded, still watching her with that same, steady gaze. He seemed to be waiting for her to say more, but Elsa didn't know how to explain what she was feeling. How could she put it into words? She had been taught to hate men like him, to see them as the enemy. But here he was, standing in front of her, asking if she was okay. She couldn't understand it. "You're doing good work," he said after a moment, breaking the silence. "We appreciate it." Elsa nodded, though she didn't feel like it was anything special. The work was simple, nothing to be praised for. But the kindness in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, caught her off guard. It made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was a strange feeling, one she wasn't sure she could trust. But it was there, quietly settling in her chest, a warmth that contradicted everything she had been taught to believe. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James gave her a small smile before turning to leave, but not before giving her one last look. A look that said more than words ever could. Elsa watched him walk away, her thoughts swirling in 100 different directions. She had never imagined she would find herself in a situation like this. A situation where the enemy was kind, where the lines between right and wrong were not so clearly defined. But here she was, standing on American soil, questioning everything she had ever known. And for the first time since her capture, she wasn't sure if she had the answers anymore. The days in the camp continued to blur together, each one passing in a haze of uncertainty. Elsa woke each morning to the sound of birds singing in the trees outside the barracks, the bright morning sun filtering through the windows, and the fresh, warm air that made everything feel different from what she had known. The small, everyday details of life in the camp began to take root in her mind. There were small moments, like when the American soldiers gave them extra food, or when they would smile at her as they passed by. But nothing compared to the feeling she had when she saw James again. She hadn't expected to see him so soon, but there he was, standing at the edge of the camp, looking over the prisoners as they worked. Elsa's heart skipped a beat when their eyes met, and for a brief moment, everything around her faded into the background. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. As the days passed, Elsa noticed that she was looking for him, waiting for those small interactions, those moments of kindness that seemed so rare and precious. She had grown accustomed to seeing him around, sometimes watching her from a distance, other times exchanging a quiet word or two. His presence had become a constant, and Elsa began to realize how much she had come to rely on those brief encounters to help her navigate this strange new world. One afternoon, as Elsa was walking to the mess hall, she spotted James near the fence, talking to another soldier. Their conversation was brief, but as James turned to walk away, he caught her eye. Without a word, he gave her a small, subtle nod. It was as if he was acknowledging something that Elsa couldn't quite understand. For the first time in weeks, Elsa felt something stir within her, an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. She wasn't sure what it was, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. Later that evening, as Elsa sat alone in the barracks, she replayed the moment in her mind. What had it meant? Why did it feel so important? She had never expected to feel this way, especially not in the midst of war, but there it was. She felt a connection, a pull toward James, something deeper than just a fleeting glance. It was confusing, and Elsa wasn't sure if she should be afraid of it or embrace it. She had been taught to hate the Americans, to see them as the enemy, but here she was, questioning everything. The propaganda she had been fed her entire life was slowly unraveling, piece by piece. She had thought she understood the world, thought she knew what it meant to be a soldier, a prisoner, an enemy. But now, standing in this unfamiliar place, she realized that the lines between right and wrong weren't as clear as she had once believed. The next few days were filled with more of the same: work, silence, and moments of quiet reflection. Elsa continued to watch James from a distance, each interaction leaving her with more questions than answers. She found herself wondering what he saw when he looked at her. Did he see her as just another prisoner, another enemy to be dealt with? Or was there something more, something in her that he recognized? Elsa couldn't help but feel the weight of those questions pressing down on her. It was hard to focus on anything else when her mind was so consumed by them. One evening, as the sun began to set and the camp grew quiet, Elsa found herself standing outside the barracks, looking out at the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. It was as if the world had slowed down, giving her a moment to breathe. She didn't know how long she stood there, lost in the beauty of the moment, but eventually, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and there he was, James. He had approached quietly, as he always did, and now stood just a few feet away, watching her. Elsa's heart raced, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. The silence between them stretched, and she could feel the weight of their shared gaze. Then, without a word, James stepped forward, his eyes soft, and offered her a small, hesitant smile. Elsa smiled back, unsure of what it meant, but somehow feeling that it was enough. It wasn't much, but in that brief moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the strange connection they shared. Elsa knew that this was only the beginning, that things were changing, but for now, all she could do was hold on to that moment, as fleeting as it was. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elsa felt something shift inside her, a quiet hope that she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this strange new world than she had been led to believe. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Elsa found herself growing more attuned to the rhythm of camp life. The heat of the Virginia sun, the simple routines, and the quiet conversations with the other prisoners began to feel almost normal. Yet, every time she glanced at James, she felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, something that grew stronger with each interaction. One afternoon, while she was working near the camp's main building, she heard someone calling her name. Turning around, she saw James approaching with a small smile on his face. "Hey, Elsa," he said, his voice casual but kind. "How are you doing today?" Elsa was taken aback by the question. She had become so accustomed to keeping her emotions locked away, but something about James's genuine concern made her want to answer honestly. "I'm doing all right," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "It's not easy, but I'm getting by." James nodded, his eyes scanning her face, as if searching for something. "You seem like you're doing better," he said thoughtfully. Elsa wasn't sure how to respond to that. She had never felt like she was doing better, at least not in the way he seemed to mean. But there was something about his tone, something that made her believe he saw more than just a prisoner, more than just a German woman in a foreign land. She had never expected that from him, and yet here it was, in the way he looked at her, in the way he spoke. There was no judgment, no hatred, just an understanding she had never known before. They stood in silence for a moment, a quiet connection passing between them, before James spoke again. "I brought you something," he said, pulling a small, wrapped package from his pocket. Elsa's eyes widened in surprise as he handed it to her. "What is it?" she asked, cautiously taking the package from his hands. "It's nothing special, just a little treat," James replied with a shrug. Elsa carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a small piece of chocolate. She hadn't tasted chocolate in what felt like a lifetime. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it meant more to her than she could express. Elsa looked down at the chocolate in her hands, feeling a lump form in her throat. It wasn't just the chocolate. It was the kindness behind the gesture, the humanity that she had not expected to find here. She had been conditioned to believe that Americans were cold, cruel, and ruthless. But with James, she was seeing a different side of them, a side that felt warm, real, and kind. As she took a small bite of the chocolate, the sweetness lingered in her mouth, reminding her of the things she had lost. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the camp, a life where she wasn't just a prisoner, a victim of war. It was a fleeting thought, but it was there, and it was enough to give her hope. James watched her with a quiet intensity, his gaze never leaving her face. There was something in his eyes, something that Elsa couldn't quite place, but it made her heart race. She quickly looked away, embarrassed by the way her emotions had been stirred. "I should get back to work," she said, her voice shaky. James nodded, giving her a small smile. "I'll see you later," he said, turning to walk away. Elsa watched him go, her heart still pounding in her chest. She didn't know what this connection between them meant, but she couldn't ignore it. There was something there, something that made her question everything she had believed about herself, about him, and about the world around her. Over the next few days, Elsa found herself looking for him, searching for those brief moments of interaction that seemed to fill her with an unfamiliar warmth. But James was always busy, always caught up in his duties as a soldier. She tried to push the thoughts of him away, telling herself that it was just a passing feeling, that it was nothing more than the loneliness of captivity. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was something real, something she couldn't ignore. One evening, as the camp settled into its usual quiet, Elsa found herself standing outside, gazing up at the stars. The night sky was clear, the moon shining brightly above, and for the first time in weeks, she felt at peace. She wasn't sure why, but in that moment, everything seemed to make sense. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future held, but she felt a small glimmer of hope. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her from her thoughts, and she turned to see James standing there, a few feet away. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft. Elsa smiled, her heart skipping a beat. "Of course," she replied, stepping aside to make room for him. They stood together in silence, watching the stars above. The air was cool, and for a moment, everything felt still and peaceful. Elsa didn't need to say anything. Just having James there, standing beside her, was enough. It was a simple moment, but to Elsa, it felt like everything had changed. The world around her might still be uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like there was something worth holding on to. The next morning, Elsa found herself waking with a strange sense of anticipation. She couldn't quite explain it, but something in the air felt different, as if the world around her was shifting, and with it, so was she. As the sun rose over the camp, casting long shadows across the fields, she went about her daily chores with an odd sense of focus. The routine had become familiar, comforting in its predictability, but today, it felt as if something was waiting just beyond her reach. She had seen James only a few times in the past few days, their interactions brief and fleeting, but those small moments, those quiet exchanges, had begun to feel more significant. Elsa didn't know what to make of it. She had been taught to keep her distance from the enemy, to remain cold and detached, but James was different. He had shown her a kindness she hadn't expected, and that kindness had slowly started to chip away at the wall she had built around her heart. Later that afternoon, as Elsa worked in the mess hall, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. She turned to find James standing in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room until they settled on her. For a moment, she froze, not sure what to say or how to react. She had grown accustomed to his presence, but now, it felt different. There was a quiet intensity in the way he looked at her, something unspoken that seemed to hang between them. "Hey, Elsa," he said, his voice calm but warm. "Do you have a minute?" Elsa nodded, her heart racing as she set aside the tray she was holding. "Of course," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. James stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. "I was wondering if you'd like to take a walk later," he said, his tone casual, but there was a hint of something deeper in his words. Elsa blinked, surprised by the request. She hadn't expected him to ask her to spend time together outside of the usual routine. It was a simple thing, a walk, but it felt like an invitation to something more, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. She hesitated, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "A walk," she repeated, her voice quiet. James smiled. A small, reassuring smile that made her heart skip a beat. Yeah, just a walk around the camp. Nothing special, just some fresh air. I thought it might be nice. Elsa felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't just the walk. It was the way he was looking at her, the way he was asking her to spend time with him. It felt like an unspoken understanding had formed between them, something that went beyond words, beyond the simple tasks they had been assigned. Okay, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd like that. James's smile grew wider, and for a moment, Elsa thought she saw something in his eyes, something warm, something sincere. It was a look she hadn't expected, and yet, in that instant, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Later that afternoon, they met by the edge of the camp, where the tall grass swayed in the breeze. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over everything, and for a brief moment, Elsa felt like she was seeing the world with fresh eyes. James walked beside her in silence, his presence comforting, like a steady anchor in a world that had become increasingly uncertain. They didn't need to speak. The quiet between them was easy, natural. It wasn't awkward, like Elsa had feared it might be. Instead, it was peaceful, almost like a shared understanding that didn't need words. As they walked, Elsa noticed the small things, the way the birds chirped in the distance, the rustling of the leaves in the trees, the sound of their footsteps on the dirt path. It was simple, but it was enough to make her feel grounded, like she was part of something bigger than the chaos of war. James seemed content, walking beside her without rushing, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He looked at the horizon, then at her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Elsa felt a shiver run down her spine, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, something she didn't have a name for. Something that felt like it had been building between them for weeks, but that had only just started to surface. They continued walking in silence for a while longer, the sun dipping lower in the sky as the day turned to dusk. Elsa wasn't sure how long they had been walking, but time seemed to slow down, the world narrowing to just the two of them. Finally, they stopped at a small clearing, where the grass grew tall and wild. Elsa took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill her lungs. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this, how much she had needed a moment of peace, of connection. James turned to her, his expression serious now, but still warm. I'm glad you came out here with me, he said softly. Elsa nodded, her heart beating faster. Me too, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, side by side, watching as the last light of the day faded away. It was a simple moment, but it felt like a turning point, like something was shifting between them. Elsa didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she felt like she was no longer alone in this strange new world. And for the first time since she had been captured, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. As the weeks went by, Elsa's world began to shift in ways she couldn't have imagined. The days blurred together in a haze of routine, but now, there was something different about the way she saw everything. Each time she crossed paths with James, something unspoken passed between them. It was subtle, but Elsa felt it. There was a quiet understanding in the way he looked at her, a warmth in his smile, and a kindness in his voice that she had never expected. It was hard to ignore, harder still to resist. She found herself thinking about him more than she'd like to admit, wondering what it all meant. It wasn't just the way he treated her. It was something deeper, something that pulled her in despite the confusion she felt inside. But Elsa couldn't allow herself to fully embrace these thoughts. She had been a prisoner for so long. She had spent so much time surviving, that the idea of hope, of something beyond mere existence, felt foreign to her. She had learned to shut off her emotions, to keep her distance, especially from someone like James. He was the enemy, after all. He was an American soldier, the very person she had been taught to fear and hate. But now, as the days passed, it seemed impossible to deny the bond that was growing between them. One afternoon, as Elsa was working in the camp's garden, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see James walking toward her, his usual calm demeanor in place, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that she hadn't seen before. Hey, Elsa, he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. Got a minute? Elsa paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. It had become a habit, almost a comfort, to avoid him, to focus on the work at hand, and ignore the growing feelings inside her. But today, something felt different. She couldn't push him away. "Of course," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron as she stood up. "What's on your mind?" James seemed to hesitate, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, his gaze shifting to the ground for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "How are you really doing?" Elsa blinked, caught off guard by the question. She had become so accustomed to brushing off inquiries about her well-being, to keeping her emotions hidden, that she didn't know how to respond. It was easier to say nothing, to stay distant, to be the strong, silent prisoner. But with James standing there, looking at her with genuine concern, she found it difficult to maintain that distance. "I'm managing," she said, her voice low. "But it's not easy." James nodded, taking a step closer. "I know," he said softly. "I can't imagine what you've been through. I just want you to know that I'm here. If you need anything at all, just let me know." Elsa felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at his words, but she quickly pushed it down. She couldn't let herself feel anything for him. He was the enemy, a soldier in the very army that had taken her captive. Yet, despite the logical part of her brain that told her to keep her distance, Elsa felt something else, something human, something real. They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them, before James spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I know this isn't easy, but I hope you know that you're not alone here," he said, his words filled with sincerity. Elsa didn't know how to respond. The weight of his kindness, the way he cared without asking for anything in return, was overwhelming. She had never known this kind of treatment, not from anyone. Not from the Germans who had captured her, and certainly not from the Americans who had fought against her. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It was all she could manage, but in that moment, it felt like the most honest thing she had said in a long time. James gave her a small, understanding smile, before turning to walk away. Elsa watched him go, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She didn't know what this connection between them meant, but she couldn't ignore it. It was becoming more real with each passing day, and it was changing her in ways she didn't fully understand. Over the next few days, Elsa found herself looking for those small moments, those brief exchanges with James that seemed to make everything else fade into the background. She couldn't deny that she was starting to feel something, but she wasn't sure if it was hope or something more complicated. The feelings she had buried deep inside for so long were beginning to resurface, and it was both frightening and exhilarating. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, Elsa found herself standing outside, lost in thought. The world around her seemed peaceful, the air cool against her skin, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax. But as she stood there, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to find James once again walking toward her, his expression more serious than usual. "Elsa," he said softly, his voice carrying an unspoken weight. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about how hard everything is." Elsa's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what to say, so she just listened, waiting for him to continue. "I don't know what's going to happen in the future," he said, his tone steady. "But I do know this. Whatever comes, we'll get through it together." Elsa felt a lump form in her throat, but she didn't speak. She couldn't find the words to express what she was feeling. She had spent so long surviving, so long fighting just to get through each day, that the idea of trusting someone, of relying on them, felt foreign to her. But in that moment, standing there with James, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could let go of some of her fear. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to trust again. The days were growing longer, and with each new morning, Elsa felt the weight of uncertainty pressing heavier on her shoulders. The routine of camp life had become second nature to her, the long hours of work, the brief exchanges with her fellow prisoners, the quiet moments she shared with James. But despite the normalcy of it all, something was shifting within her. The connection she had with James was undeniable. It wasn't just the kindness he showed her, or the moments of understanding they shared. It was something deeper, something unspoken that made her feel alive again, after months of being numb, just surviving. Yet, she couldn't ignore the fear that came with it. Elsa had spent so much of her life building walls, shutting out the world to protect herself from pain. The thought of letting someone in, especially someone like James, made her feel vulnerable in ways she hadn't experienced in years. She couldn't afford to be vulnerable. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. And yet, every time she saw James, every time their eyes met across the camp, it became harder to pretend that those walls still held strong. She tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the work at hand, the tasks that needed to be completed. But no matter how hard she tried, her mind always wandered back to him. One afternoon, as Elsa was walking back from the supply tent, she found herself once again caught in James's gaze. This time, he didn't look away. His eyes held hers for a long moment, and something in that gaze made her heart race. It wasn't just the usual glance between soldier and prisoner. This was different. There was something more, something that made Elsa feel as though the world had stopped turning for a brief, impossible moment. "Hey," James said, his voice low and almost hesitant. Elsa blinked, startled out of her thoughts. "Hey," she replied, her voice shaky, unsure of what to say next. James took a step closer, his hands shoved in his pockets. "I was wondering if you wanted to grab some dinner later. Maybe talk?" he asked, his voice casual, but with a hint of something else, something Elsa couldn't quite place. She felt a rush of emotions flood her chest. It was such a simple invitation, but it felt like everything was hanging on it. Dinner. Talking. It seemed so ordinary, so small, yet it felt monumental. Elsa opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She wanted to say yes, wanted to let herself experience the normal, human connection that had eluded her for so long. But she was afraid. Afraid of what it might mean, afraid of what would happen if she let herself be seen, really seen, by someone else. She had spent so long hiding, so long behind the walls she had built, that the idea of breaking them down terrified her. But looking at James, standing there with that small, hopeful smile, Elsa felt the walls inside her begin to crack. "I'd like that," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. James's smile widened, and Elsa felt a strange warmth in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was simple, but it felt like a promise. "Great," he said. "I'll see you later then." Elsa nodded, watching as he walked away. Her heart was still racing, but now, there was a sense of anticipation that she couldn't ignore. As the evening approached, Elsa found herself standing outside, looking up at the sky. The stars were beginning to appear, scattered across the darkening canvas, and for a moment, she felt a sense of calm. It was as though the world had slowed down, just for her. She didn't know what this dinner with James would mean, or where it would lead, but she knew that something was changing inside her. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to live again. When the time finally came, Elsa made her way to the spot where she had agreed to meet James. She felt nervous, her hands slightly trembling as she approached. But when she saw him standing there, waiting for her, all the nerves seemed to fade away. James was smiling, his expression warm and genuine, and in that moment, Elsa felt something shift. This was real. She wasn't just a prisoner, a victim of war. She was a person. She was human. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she mattered. They walked together to the small mess area, where a simple meal had been prepared. It wasn't much, just bread, some vegetables, and a few slices of meat. But to Elsa, it felt like a feast. They sat down together at a small table, and for a while, there was nothing but the sound of their quiet conversation, the clink of utensils on plates. It was easy. It was comfortable. For the first time since she had arrived in America, Elsa felt like she could breathe again. As they ate, Elsa found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She talked about her family, about the life she had left behind in Germany, and about the strange, overwhelming feeling of being caught between two worlds. James listened quietly, offering words of comfort, but never pushing her. And for the first time, Elsa felt like she wasn't alone. She wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She was someone with a story, with a future. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted, and Elsa found herself laughing for the first time in a long time. It wasn't a forced laugh or a nervous one. It was real, and it felt good. And for that moment, Elsa allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future beyond the walls of the camp, beyond the war. A future where she could be more than just a survivor. A future where she could live. After dinner, James walked her back to the barracks. They stood outside for a moment, neither of them saying anything, but both of them knowing that this moment meant something. "Thank you," Elsa said, her voice soft. "I really needed this." James smiled. "Me too," he replied. And in that moment, Elsa realized that this was just the beginning. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she could face it. Together, the following days passed by in a blur of small, meaningful moments that Elsa found difficult to ignore. She was starting to realize that she had let herself become more than just a prisoner of war. She was beginning to feel like a person again, someone with a future, someone who was seen. As she spent more time with James, their conversations growing deeper and more meaningful, she felt a part of herself she had long since buried slowly begin to wake up. Each moment they shared felt like a step into uncharted territory, and Elsa didn't know whether she should be excited or afraid. It was hard to trust this new sense of normalcy, this feeling of being valued, of being more than just a nameless face in the crowd. But with James, things were different. He saw her, not as the enemy, not as a soldier or a prisoner, but as a person. And that was a feeling Elsa hadn't experienced in a long time. One afternoon, as she sat with him by the camp's edge, watching the sun slowly begin to set over the horizon, Elsa found herself wondering how long this would last. The camp was still a place of uncertainty, a place where everything could change in an instant. But somehow, in that quiet moment, with the air cooling and the world around them slowly settling into the peaceful rhythm of evening, Elsa felt at peace. "You know, I never thought I'd be here," Elsa said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. James glanced at her, his expression softening. "Here, in America?" he asked, his voice gentle. Elsa nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," she replied. "I thought I knew everything. I thought I understood who the enemy was. But now, I don't know." She let out a long breath, her thoughts drifting to the past, to the war that had led her here, to the moments when she had believed in nothing but survival. "It's strange," she continued. "I thought I'd hate everything about this place. But it's not like I thought. It's not what I expected." James remained silent, letting her words hang in the air between them. He didn't rush to fill the silence with words of reassurance, but rather, he just sat beside her, offering her the comfort of his presence. Elsa looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some kind of answer, some way to make sense of the storm of emotions inside her. But she found only kindness and understanding. She had expected to find an enemy in James, someone who would reinforce the walls she had spent years building around herself. But instead, she found a person who treated her with dignity, a person who didn't view her as a prisoner but as a human being. "I never expected this," Elsa said, her voice quiet, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "I never thought I'd have a conversation like this. Not with someone like you." James turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think anyone expected this," he said softly. "But here we are." They shared a quiet moment, the world around them slipping into a calm dusk. Elsa felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. It was as though everything that had come before, the war, the fear, the constant survival, was slowly fading away, replaced by something new, something that felt both terrifying and freeing. "Do you ever wonder what happens after all of this?" Elsa asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. "After the war is over?" James took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for answers in the fading light. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "What happens when it's all over? But right now, I'm just trying to get through today. And today, I'm here with you." Elsa felt a small smile tug at her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a promise of something more, something she couldn't quite grasp yet, but knew was waiting for her. "I think that's enough," she said softly. "For today, at least." James turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "Yeah, I think so too." They sat there together in silence, the night slowly enveloping them as the stars began to twinkle above. Elsa felt the weight of everything that had come before her. The war, the fear, the loss. But she also felt something new stirring within her. Something that felt like hope. It wasn't a loud, overwhelming hope, but a quiet, steady feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Maybe she didn't have to carry the weight of the past alone. Maybe there was a future out there for her, one that didn't have to be defined by the war. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fear it. The next few days were filled with more quiet conversations, more stolen moments. With James, each one leaving her with a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. It was like a door had been opened inside her, a door she had been afraid to even look at for so long. But with James by her side, the door didn't seem so intimidating anymore. And with each passing day, Elsa found herself taking small steps into a world she had never imagined, a world where kindness, hope, and trust could exist, even in the darkest of times. The days passed with a quiet rhythm, each one folding into the next, and Elsa found herself growing more comfortable in the new life she was building in the camp. The fear she had carried with her from the beginning began to fade, replaced by a sense of quiet acceptance. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was someone who was starting to find her way again. And with James by her side, those small, fleeting moments they shared were becoming more significant. Each glance, each conversation, was like a thread weaving her back into the fabric of life, into something that felt almost like normal. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. Elsa had learned to appreciate the simple things, the warmth of the sun on her face, the taste of fresh food, the sound of laughter from the other prisoners. These were things she had once taken for granted, but now, they felt like gifts. Even though the war was still raging far beyond the camp, Elsa was learning how to live again. One afternoon, while working in the garden, Elsa found herself lost in thought. She was digging carefully around a row of vegetables when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Hey, Elsa," James said, his voice calm and steady. She smiled, wiping her hands on her apron before turning to face him. "Hi, James," she said. "What brings you here?" James looked down at the patch of earth she was tending to, his expression thoughtful. "I was just walking by and thought I'd see how you were doing," he said. Elsa raised an eyebrow, surprised by the gesture. "You're checking on me?" she asked, her voice teasing. James chuckled softly, scratching the back of his head. "Well, I figured it was time for another walk, if you're up for it." Elsa's heart skipped a beat at the thought of spending time with him again. It had become something she looked forward to more than she cared to admit. She nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I'd like that," she said. Together, they walked through the camp, the sun beginning to set in the distance. The evening air was cool, and the sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange. Elsa felt at peace in these moments, the simple act of walking side by side with James giving her a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. As they walked, they talked about everything and nothing at all. Elsa shared stories about her life before the war, about her family and the small town she had grown up in. James listened intently, asking questions, but never pressing for details. It was an easy conversation, the kind that felt natural, like the two of them had known each other far longer than they actually had. For the first time in a long time, Elsa felt like she was no longer defined by the war. She wasn't just a prisoner, a victim, or someone caught in a world of violence and loss. She was a person, a woman with a past, with hopes, with dreams. And James was someone who saw that, who treated her like a person, not a statistic or a casualty of war. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to more personal matters. James began to speak about his own life, about his childhood, about the people he had left behind when he joined the army. Elsa listened closely, noticing the vulnerability in his voice, something she had never expected from him. "You know," James said, his voice quieter now, "sometimes I wonder what life would be like if none of this had happened. If the war had never come, if we hadn't been separated by all of this." Elsa nodded, understanding the depth of his words. "I think about that too," she said softly. "What if things were different? What if we were just normal people, living normal lives?" The thought of that life seemed so far removed from their current reality. It was hard to imagine a world without war, without fear, without the constant tension that hung in the air. But in that moment, as they walked, side by side, Elsa allowed herself to picture it, to imagine a future where she wasn't defined by the war. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was shared, an understanding between two people who had seen too much of the world's cruelty but still clung to the hope that there was something better out there. "I don't know what the future holds," Elsa said after a long pause. "But I do know that I'm not alone in it anymore. And that makes all the difference." James looked at her, his expression softening. "You're not alone," he said, his voice steady. "Not now, not ever." The sincerity in his words, the unwavering certainty, made Elsa's heart swell with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't love, Not yet, but it was something close. It was trust. It was a bond that had been forged in the fires of war, but that now, in this quiet moment, felt like something more, something worth holding on to. As they continued their walk, the sky darkening above them, Elsa realized that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking back at the past. She wasn't stuck in the fear and the grief that had defined her for so long. She was looking forward, to the future, to whatever came next. And with James by her side, whatever it was, she felt ready to face it. As Elsa woke up to another bright morning, a strange feeling lingered in her chest. The days seemed to be unfolding in slow motion now, each one feeling like a gentle breeze carrying her forward into uncharted territory. She had spent so much time in fear and uncertainty, yet now, with each passing moment, she felt a little less afraid. Something had changed inside her. The bond between her and James had deepened in ways she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the quiet walks, the shared meals, or the comforting words. It was something unspoken, something in the way he looked at her that made her feel seen, truly seen for the first time in years. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore, even though a part of her still clung to the belief that this was temporary. That when the war ended, when things went back to normal, she would be just another face in the crowd, another prisoner left behind in the chaos of a world torn apart by conflict. But with James, she began to wonder if maybe that didn't have to be true. The morning air was still cool as Elsa made her way to the small garden where she spent most of her days. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden light over the camp. As she knelt to tend to the plants, her mind wandered back to the night before, to the quiet moments they had shared, to the way her heart had raced when he had taken her hand. She hadn't expected to feel this way. But here, in this strange place, in the midst of a war that had taken everything from her, she had found something unexpected, something that made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe there was hope after all. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to find James approaching. His face was slightly shadowed by the brim of his cap, but his smile was warm, as always. "Morning, Elsa," he greeted, his voice soft. "How's the garden today?" Elsa smiled, her heart lifting at the sight of him. "It's doing well," she replied, standing up to wipe her hands on her apron. "Everything's growing nicely." James stepped closer, his eyes scanning the plants before returning to her face. "I'm glad to hear that. You've got a real knack for this," he said. Elsa's smile grew wider. "It's the only thing I've been good at for a while now," she said, her voice light. "But I'm glad it's something I can do here." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're good at a lot of things, Elsa," he said quietly. She met his gaze, feeling the weight of his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe them. She wasn't just a prisoner. She wasn't just a casualty of war. She was a person, with a past, with a future, and with the ability to make a difference, even if that difference was small. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice catching in her throat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was charged with something unspoken, something that neither could ignore but neither dared to name. Finally, James broke the silence. "I was wondering," he began, his voice low, "if you'd like to take a walk later. Just the two of us. Away. From the camp, somewhere quiet." Elsa's heart skipped a beat at the thought. She had become so used to seeing him in the camp, surrounded by soldiers and other prisoners, that the idea of being alone with him, just the two of them, felt both exciting and terrifying. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was what she wanted. A chance to be free, even if just for a little while. "I'd like that," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I'd like that very much." Later that afternoon, they met by the edge of the camp, where the trees met the open fields. The air was warm, and the world felt impossibly quiet, as if it was holding its breath. They walked side by side, neither of them speaking at first, just letting the silence stretch between them. Elsa felt a strange sense of peace as they moved further from the camp, further from the past, and closer to something new. As they walked, the weight of their surroundings seemed to fade away. The soft rustling of the leaves, the distant sound of the birds, and the quiet murmur of their footsteps on the dirt path were the only sounds that filled the air. It was simple, but it felt like freedom. It felt like life. They walked for what seemed like hours, the sun dipping lower in the sky as the evening approached. Finally, they stopped at a small clearing, the grass soft beneath their feet. James turned to Elsa, his expression thoughtful, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I've been thinking about the future," he said finally, his voice quiet. Elsa looked at him, unsure of where this conversation was going. "What about it?" she asked. James paused, looking down at the ground before meeting her eyes again. "I don't know what's going to happen after all of this, after the war ends. But I do know that I want to make the most of the time we have now, whatever that looks like." Elsa felt her heart beat faster as his words sank in. She wasn't sure what the future held either, but in that moment, with the sun setting behind them and the world feeling so vast and full of possibility, she realized that it didn't matter. What mattered was right now. What mattered was this moment, this walk, this connection that was slowly, quietly, changing everything. "I want that too," she said, her voice steady, filled with a quiet certainty she hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't know what the future holds, but for now, I'm here, and that's enough." James smiled, and in that smile, Elsa saw something more than just kindness. She saw hope, and for the first time in a long time, she believed in it. The days that followed felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from Elsa's shoulders. Each moment with James brought something new, something comforting, and she couldn't deny that she was beginning to see a future, one that didn't seem as bleak and uncertain as it had just weeks ago. She had spent so much of her life focused on survival, never allowing herself the luxury of hope. But now, with every glance, every quiet conversation, it was starting to feel possible again. The small moments they shared felt like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was trying to complete. One evening, as Elsa stood outside, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The camp, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed like a place where she could breathe, if only for a moment. The past still loomed over her, but with James, it didn't feel as heavy. She heard footsteps approaching and turned to see him walking toward her. He looked as he always did, calm, steady, with a smile that made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't expected. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "I thought I'd find you out here." Elsa smiled, her heart skipping a beat. "I like to watch the sunset," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," he said, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. Elsa turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his face for the words he wasn't saying. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft but full of curiosity. James took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. "I don't know what's going to happen after the war," he said, "but I do know that the time we've spent here, together, means something. It's not just about surviving anymore. It's about living. And I want to keep living, Elsa, with you." Elsa's heart fluttered in her chest, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had spent so long building walls around herself, pushing away the things she wanted most, that hearing James's words felt almost overwhelming. She had never allowed herself to dream of a future beyond the war, beyond the pain and loss. But now, standing here with him, the possibility of something more seemed real. She took a step closer, her breath catching in her throat. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that I don't want to face it alone." James reached out, gently taking her hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down her spine, and she felt something stir inside her, a quiet hope she hadn't known she still had. "You won't be alone," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Not now, not ever." Elsa's heart felt full, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future. A future where she wasn't just a prisoner, where she wasn't defined by the war and everything it had taken from her. With James by her side, anything felt possible. They stood there for a moment, the world around them slowly fading into the quiet of the evening. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the air was cool, a gentle reminder that the day was coming to an end. But for Elsa, the end of the day felt like a beginning she had never dared to imagine. As they stood together, hand in hand, Elsa realized that she didn't need to know what the future held. She didn't need to have all the answers. All she needed was this moment, this connection, this feeling of being seen and heard. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive. And as the sun sank lower in the sky, Elsa let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. As Elsa stood by the edge of the camp, the cool evening air wrapped around her like a quiet blanket, she couldn't help but feel the enormity of everything that had changed. The war had come to define so much of her life. The fear, the pain, the loss. But now, standing here, looking at the fading light in the sky, she realized that the war no longer held her captive. Not in the way it had before. There was still much to face, much to understand, but the weight of it all seemed lighter now. Perhaps it was the certainty in James's words. Perhaps it was the way he had made her feel seen when she had forgotten how to truly see herself. Or maybe it was just the simple, quiet moments they had shared, where the world seemed to pause and let them breathe. The days in the camp were still filled with their own set of challenges. Elsa had not forgotten where she was, and she knew that the war was still a reality, still shaping the world around her. But as she spent more time with James, she began to see the world differently. The small acts of kindness that had once seemed insignificant now felt like lifelines. Whether it was the way he listened to her, or the way he had cared for her without expectation, Elsa felt herself softening, her heart opening to the possibility of something more. One evening, as they sat together under the stars, their conversation flowed easily, like they had known each other for years. Elsa found herself laughing, something she hadn't done in so long. It was a genuine laugh, not one born from nervousness or the need to keep her distance, but one that came from a place of joy. It was the kind of laughter that reminded her of who she had been before the war, the woman who had dreams, who had hope, who had love in her life. "You know," Elsa said, her voice warm, "I never thought I'd find myself here. I thought this would be my life forever. The camp, the war, just surviving." James nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I think a lot of us thought that," he said quietly, "that it was just about getting through each day, about surviving whatever came next. But it's more than that, Elsa. We can make something more out of this. We can find ways to live, even in the darkest of times." Elsa met his eyes, the sincerity in his words making her heart swell. She had never imagined that she would be sitting here, talking like this, with someone who made her feel so understood, so human. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We can find something more, even here." James reached over and took her hand in his touch gentle but grounding. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice low, "I'll be here. We'll get through this together, no matter what comes next." Elsa squeezed his hand, the weight of his words settling over her like a comforting blanket. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet of the night, she allowed herself to believe him. She had spent so much of her life feeling alone, isolated in a world that had been torn apart by war. But now, with James by her side, she didn't feel so alone anymore. Together, they were creating something new, something that transcended the war, something that gave her the strength to keep going. As the night wore on, they sat together, their hands still entwined, looking up at the stars above. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Elsa felt a sense of peace. Whatever happened next, whatever the war brought, she knew that she didn't have to face it alone. With James, she had found something worth holding on to. And in that quiet, simple moment, she let herself believe that there was a future beyond the war, a future where they could build something together, a future where the war would no longer define her, where love, trust, and hope would lead the way.